A school gate in Ottawa. A boy, 11 years old, walks out and finds his mother standing outside, crying, unraveling, unable to hold herself together. He puts his arms around her. "It'll be okay, Mom," he said. "Things will get better." That boy grew up to become the Prime Minister of Canada. His mother had been the Prime Minister's wife, and for 30 years, through the tunnels and the running and the losses that broke her open, nobody told her the truth. She wasn't unstable. She was sick. And nobody, not one doctor, not one protocol, not the most powerful house in Canada, had thought to say so. This is her story. Welcome. It is good to have you with us. Tonight, we ask a question that history rarely bothers to ask. Not about the man who holds power, but about the woman who lives inside it. We know what power looks like from the outside. We have seen the motorcades, the state dinners, the press conferences, the flags at half-mast. We have read the biographies, the memoirs, the official accounts. We know the decisions that shaped nations. We know the names carved into buildings. But there is another room in every story of power, a quieter room, a room with no official title, no protocol, no ceremony to mark its suffering. And the people who live in that room, the wives, the children, the ones who did not choose the throne but were pulled into its orbit, they tend to disappear from the record. Not because their stories are small, but because their stories are private. And power has a habit of making private things invisible. Tonight's story takes us to Canada, to a country that for 16 years across 2 decades was governed by a man named Pierre Trudeau. A philosopher, a politician, a man so compelling that his arrival in public life was called, without irony, Trudeau-mania. A man so enduring that his eldest son would one day follow him into the same office, into the same building, into the same weight. But tonight, we are not telling Pierre Trudeau's story. We are telling the story of the woman who married him. Her name was Margaret Sinclair. She was 22 years old when she became the youngest First Lady in Canadian history. She was a flower child from Vancouver, a girl who had grown up barefoot near the Pacific, who believed in love and freedom and the open sky. She had met Pierre on a beach in Tahiti when she was 18. He was 48. She was not immediately interested. He was persistent. And then, in a ceremony so secret that her own family thought they were gathering for a portrait, she became his wife. The world was enchanted. A hippie and a prime minister, youth and gravitas, wildflowers and the weight of a nation. The photographs from those early years show 2 people luminous with something that looked, from the outside, very much like joy. But inside 24 Sussex Drive, the grand official residence of Canada's Prime Minister, something else was beginning. Something quiet. Something with no name yet. She would spend 13 years trying to understand what it was. This is that story. There is a beach in French Polynesia, where in the summer of 1967, 2 people happened to be vacationing at the same time. One was Pierre Trudeau, 52 years old, recently elected leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, on the verge of becoming one of the most recognizable politicians in the Western world. He was lean, disciplined, intellectually formidable. He had spent his life in the company of ideas. He had never married. He had, by all accounts, never particularly wanted to. The other was Margaret Sinclair, 18 years old, daughter of a Vancouver politician, a student who had recently discovered that the world was wider than the life she had been given. She was, by her own description, a flower child. She believed in the goodness of open spaces, in music, in bare feet on warm sand. She was, in the language of her generation, free. When they were introduced on that beach in Tahiti, Margaret later recalled, she was not impressed. He was 48. She was 18. The distance between them, in age, in temperament, in the sheer weight of the world each of them carried, was not a gap. It was a chasm. But Pierre Trudeau was not a man accustomed to being uninteresting to people. He pursued her. Quietly at first, then with the kind of focused attention that, in a philosopher-politician, can feel indistinguishable from love. He wrote letters. He called. He appeared, in the way that powerful men sometimes appear, at the edges of her life. And Margaret, young, romantic, genuinely captivated, found herself drawn to a man who spoke about ideas with the same intensity she felt about living. She would later say, "I prepared myself for my marriage to Pierre Trudeau, but I didn't prepare myself for marriage to the Prime Minister." It is the most honest thing she ever said about that time. By 1968, Pierre Trudeau had become the 15th Prime Minister of Canada, and a cultural phenomenon. Trudeau mania swept the country, with a force that baffled political observers and delighted everyone else. Women threw roses at his motorcade. Young people lined the streets of Ottawa to catch a glimpse of a politician who quoted Plato and wore sandals to Parliament. He was, in an era hungry for charisma, exactly what the moment wanted. And somewhere in Vancouver, a 19-year-old girl was watching all of this unfold and knew that the man at the center of it had been writing her letters. They kept their courtship a secret. This was, above all else, a Pierre Trudeau decision. He was a man who drew a careful line between his public life and everything else. He had told reporters for years that his private life was his own. He kept that line with a discipline that bordered on severity. Margaret, who had never had reason to hide anything, learned a new vocabulary in those years. Discretion, protocol, the careful management of what was seen and what was not. She was in love. She adapted. The wedding took place on March 4th, 1971. Pierre had told his colleagues in Ottawa that he was traveling to British Columbia for a skiing trip. The Sinclair family had been told they were gathering for a family portrait. Only 12 people knew the truth. The ceremony was held in a small chapel in North Vancouver. There was no press, no announcement, no ceremony befitting a head of state. The next morning, Canada woke up to the news. The Prime Minister, the most eligible bachelor the country had produced in a generation, the man who had famously dated actresses and intellectuals and never once looked like he might settle, had secretly married a 22-year-old from Vancouver. The reaction was, by all accounts, something close to national joy. Parliament erupted in warm applause when the news was announced. Former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, no great admirer of Trudeau, graciously credited his own marital advice. Telegrams arrived by the hundreds. Newspapers ran photographs of the couple. Pierre in his rose boutonniere, Margaret radiant and young. And the country decided collectively that this was a love story worth believing in. Margaret arrived in Ottawa as the youngest First Lady in Canadian history. She arrived believing it was a beginning. 24 Sussex Drive sits on a bluff above the Ottawa River, a large gray stone house surrounded by grounds maintained by the federal government, staffed by a household team, watched over at all times by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary place to live. Margaret would later describe it as the crown jewel of the federal penitentiary system. She did not mean it as a joke. In the early months, she tried. She genuinely tried. She learned the protocols, which fork, which greeting, which conversation was appropriate for which minister's wife. She traveled with Pierre on state visits. She smiled in the photographs. She wore the right clothes, said the right things at the right moments. But there was something in her that could not be folded into the shape the role required. She had grown up with open doors and loud kitchens and the sound of the Pacific not far away. She had grown up believing that a person's feelings were worth something, worth naming, worth expressing, worth taking seriously. Now she was living in a house where feelings were managed, where emotion was a liability, where the job, above all else, was to reflect well upon the man beside her. Pierre Trudeau was not a cruel husband. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew him well, a man given to unkindness. But he was a man of almost supernatural self-control, and he could not entirely understand a wife who was not. "I don't think Pierre Trudeau knew how to be a husband," Margaret said years later. She said it without bitterness, almost as a statement of fact. The isolation came quietly, as isolation always does. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. The dinners she could not leave early. The opinions she learned not to voice. The friends who drifted away because the security detail made casualness impossible. The loneliness of being surrounded always by people, and known, truly known, by almost none of them. "The main thing that triggered my depression," she would say, "was my isolation. That was imposed on me by becoming the wife of the Prime Minister and leaving my home, my family. I was young, very young, and very naive, and very hopeful and enthusiastic about my wonderful new life. But it was the loneliness and the lack of being able to properly relate to people." On Christmas Day 1971, 9 months after the wedding, Margaret gave birth to their first son. Justin Pierre James Trudeau came into the world on December 25, 1971. The timing was, the press decided, charming. A Christmas baby, a gift to the nation. In the private ward of the hospital, Margaret held her son and felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who had just given everything she had. Pierre was there. The RCMP were stationed outside. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, journalists were already filing the story. It was Christmas. It was also the first time Margaret understood, in her body rather than her mind, what it meant to be completely alone inside a life that looked, from the outside, full. 2 years later, on Christmas Day 1973, their second son, Alexandra, was born. Again on the 25th of December. Again in the middle of the season, the world reserved for warmth and family and closeness. This time, in the weeks that followed, Margaret could not get out of bed. She did not know what was happening to her. She knew only that the gray had come, a weight she could not name, a fog she could not lift, a retreat inward so complete that even the sound of her children felt very far away. She went to a psychiatrist. Her mother came with her. The psychiatrist listened. Then he patted her on the head. "Baby blues," he said. She walked out of his office and went home to 24 Sussex Drive. "I remember, after my first postpartum depression, I didn't know what had happened to me," she said decades later. "I was stuck in this gray depression where I just wanted to retreat and pull the covers over my head and weep. My mother and we went to a psychiatrist, and he just patted me on the head and told me I had baby blues, which was not helpful, obviously. Nobody was yet using the words that would have explained everything. Not in 1973. Not in the Prime Minister's house. Not to a young woman who was expected, above all else, to be well. She went home. She mothered her children. She stood beside her husband at the functions. And somewhere inside her, the thing that had no name continued to grow. In October 1975, their third son was born. Michel Charles Émile Trudeau, the youngest, the one Margaret would describe as the boy who combined the best of his brothers. He came into the world quietly, without the headlines that had greeted his older siblings. He was, from the beginning, something private, something that belonged to his mother in a way that the weight of a last name does not always allow. Margaret loved all three of her sons with a ferocity that was perhaps the one feeling she never had to manage. But by 1975, she had been living inside 24 Sussex Drive for 4 years. She had given birth to 3 children. She had attended hundreds of official functions. She had smiled through state dinners and campaign rallies and foreign visits and the endless, grinding machinery of a political life. And she had never once been told the truth about what was happening inside her own mind. That truth was still years away. In the meantime, there was the house, the protocols, the children upstairs, the security detail at the gate, and a woman who had once stood barefoot on a beach in Tahiti, who had once believed that freedom was simply a question of choosing it, learning, slowly, that some doors do not open from the inside. There is a particular kind of suffering that is invisible because it wears the face of ordinary life. It does not arrive with a diagnosis or a name. It does not announce itself at the door. It seeps in, through the mornings that are harder than they should be, through the afternoons that stretch into gray, through the evenings when everyone around you is talking and laughing, and you are sitting at the same table, in the same room, and you are somewhere else entirely. Margaret Trudeau lived inside that suffering for years before anyone gave it a name. And she lived inside it, this is the part that history tends to skip over, at the most visible address in Canada. By 1974, the household at 24 Sussex Drive had settled into a rhythm. Pierre governed. Margaret mothered. The press photographed them at official functions. The Prime Minister in his trademark rose boutonniere, his young wife beside him, always striking, always smiling, always slightly too bright-eyed for a woman who, in private, was beginning to come apart. She had started using marijuana. She was not secretive about it years later. In fact, she was remarkably frank. In her memoir, she recalled that marijuana gave her something the official life of 24 Sussex Drive could not: a brief loosening of the grip. A few hours in which the fog lifted. A sense, however chemical, of being present in her own skin. She smuggled it, according to her own account, in the official luggage of the Prime Minister's household. Past the RCMP. Past the security detail. Past the very architecture of the state that was supposed to protect her. It was, she understood later, a symptom, not a cause. In her own words, "A little grass gave me some light and joy and delight." Too much triggered manic episodes. She did not know that yet. She knew only that it helped, and so she kept going. What no one in 24 Sussex Drive was saying, what no doctor had yet said, what no biographer had yet written, was that Margaret Trudeau was showing every recognizable sign of bipolar disorder. The highs that came from nowhere, the days when she felt she could do anything, be anyone, when the world seemed to open like a flower and everything was vivid and possible. The crashes that followed, the gray days, the retreating, the inability to get out of bed, the weeping that had no object. The behavior that seemed, to the press and the public, and even to those who loved her, simply erratic. "I was a quicksilver girl who saw every leaf on every tree," she said once. "For me, there was no middle ground between sinking and flying. And once I was into my early adult years, my roller coaster got wilder and faster. I seemed to rise and fall with the same reckless velocity." She described it, in that sentence, with the precision of someone who had spent years making sense of something she had no framework for. At the time, she had no framework. She had only the rising and the falling, and the house, and the cameras outside the gate. The press had developed, by the mid-1970s, a reliable shorthand for Margaret Trudeau. Unpredictable, eccentric, embarrassing. The Prime Minister's wife who wore dresses that were too short to White House dinners, who burst into song at a state banquet in Venezuela, and later admitted in her memoir that she had taken peyote beforehand, who seemed constitutionally unable to perform the quiet dignity the role demanded. What the shorthand missed, what it could not see because the language for it barely existed in polite public discourse in 1975, was that she was not undisciplined. She was undiagnosed. There is a difference. It is not a small one. Pierre Trudeau, watching all of this, responded in the way that came most naturally to him, with control. He was not indifferent to Margaret's suffering. By the accounts of people close to the marriage, he was genuinely troubled by it. But his instinct, when confronted with something he could not reason through, was to manage it, to contain the disruption, to maintain the image, to ensure that the machinery of his public life continued to function. He criticized her, Margaret later recalled, daily in those years after the birth of their second son. "My husband criticized me daily," she said. "I was alone. I just thought I was going to live my life as this very desperately sad person who wept uncontrollably." She did not say this with rage. She said it the way a person describes weather, as something that happened, something that shaped the landscape of a particular time, something she had eventually walked out of. But she was not walking out yet. It was 1974. They had 3 boys under the age of 4. She was 26 years old. And the tunnel, as she would come to call it, the long tunnel of darkness she described in her first memoir, was at its deepest. In her memoirs, she referred to her life at 24 Sussex as a tunnel of darkness. With her bipolar disorder left untreated, she self-medicated with marijuana, which she said drove her mania to dangerous highs. The irony, and it is a bitter one, is that the very thing she was using to survive was making the underlying condition worse. She did not know this. No one told her. The doctor who had patted her on the head and said baby blues had sent her home. The psychiatrists she would see in subsequent years were working without the right diagnosis, because nobody, not she, not Pierre, not the physicians who attended the Prime Minister's household, was looking for the right thing. They were looking for a woman who was behaving badly. They were missing a woman who was profoundly ill. There were good days. This is important to say, because the story of Margaret Trudeau is not only a story of suffering. She loved her children with an uncomplicated ferocity that cut through everything else. She loved Justin's seriousness, the way he watched the world with those dark, attentive eyes. She loved Sasha's gentleness. She loved Michel, the youngest, the most quietly himself, with something that went beyond the ordinary vocabulary of maternal love. She photographed them constantly. It was, she would say, the thing that gave her the most direct access to joy. The camera, the act of freezing a moment, the proof that something beautiful had existed at a specific point in time. She traveled with Pierre on state visits. She met presidents and kings. She sat in rooms where the decisions of history were being made. She was, by any external measure, at the center of the world. And she was, by her own account, desperately lonely. I was a hippie in the late 60s, she said, and took to marijuana like a duck to water. It caused me difficulties in my life that I can't even mention. The difficulties she could not mention were the ones that accumulated in silence, the ones that the photographs did not show, the ones that the official record did not capture. The nights when the house felt like it was pressing in. The mornings when getting dressed required an act of will she was not sure she possessed. The particular humiliation of suffering publicly while the world watched and called it something else. By 1976, it had been 5 years. 5 years of managing the unmanageable. 5 years of performing wellness in the most watched house in Canada. 5 years of a thing growing inside her that had no name and no treatment, and no end she could see from where she was standing. Pierre had won re-election in 1974. He would govern, it was clear, for years more. The house was not going anywhere. The role was not going anywhere. And Margaret, who had once stood on a beach in Tahiti and felt in her bones that she was free, was 30 years old and could not see a way out that did not break everything. She had tried in her quiet way to say this. "I can't be a rose in any man's lapel," she said once. Not in a grand speech, not in a memoir, but in the simple, declarative tone of someone who has arrived at a truth after a very long journey. Nobody in the official life of 24 Sussex Drive knew quite what to do with that sentence. They were used to roses that stayed in their lapels. She was not that rose. She had never been that rose. And the distance between who she was and what the role required of her was not closing. It was widening, slowly, in the way that distances widen when two things are moving in opposite directions. Something was going to give. It would not be much longer now. There is a photograph that exists from the mid-1970s. Margaret Trudeau at a state function, standing beside Pierre, wearing something slightly wrong for the occasion. Her smile is wide. Her eyes are somewhere else. The photographers loved her for exactly the reasons the protocol officers feared her. She was unpredictable. She was alive in a way that the official life of a prime minister's wife was not designed to accommodate. And in the years between 1974 and 1977, that aliveness, uncontained, undiagnosed, increasingly desperate for something it could not name, began to press against the walls of 24 Sussex Drive with a force that neither she nor Pierre could any longer pretend was manageable. She was not trying to cause chaos. She was trying to breathe. The world, watching from outside the gate, could not tell the difference. There was the dress. At a state dinner at the White House, the details of which were recorded in newspapers across North America, Margaret wore something the press immediately decided was too short. The photographs were published. The commentary was not kind. She was the Prime Minister's wife. There were standards. She did not change the dress. She did not apologize. She was 26 years old, and she was standing in the most powerful room in Washington, and she wanted, simply, to be herself. That wanting, ordinary in any other woman, radioactive in hers, was taken as evidence of instability. There was the banquet in Venezuela. During a state visit, Margaret was called upon to offer a toast to the American First Lady, Rosalind Carter. The protocol called for a few gracious sentences, a raised glass, a smile. Instead, Margaret sang. She stood up at a table full of heads of state, and she sang. A spontaneous, warm, entirely inappropriate song of tribute that left the room uncertain whether to applaud or not. In her memoir, she would later admit that she had taken peyote before the event. Pierre, by all accounts, said nothing publicly. He was a man who had built his entire public life on the principle that what happened in private stayed in private. He drew the line and he held it, even when everything on the other side of the line was burning. But the press did not hold the line. The press was delighted. Eccentric, they wrote, unstable, an embarrassment to the office. She was none of those things, and all of those things simultaneously. A woman whose illness expressed itself in ways that looked, from the outside, like poor judgment, and whose poor judgment was being parsed by people who did not know, because no one knew yet, that she was sick. Justin Trudeau was 5 years old when his parents separated in 1977. He would grow up, in the years that followed, in a household that was, by the standards of ordinary childhood, extraordinary in every way that made ordinary childhood difficult. His father was the Prime Minister of Canada. His mother was the woman the newspapers wrote about when they needed a story about unpredictability in high places. He lived at 24 Sussex Drive with his father and his brothers. His mother visited. He understood, even then, more than a 5-year-old should have needed to understand. Years later, in his memoir Common Ground, published in 2014, Justin Trudeau wrote about his parents' separation with a clarity that suggested he had spent a long time finding the right words for something he had known in his body long before he could articulate it. "I had a really difficult time," he wrote, "accepting that I wasn't enough of a reason for the divorce to not happen." He was 5 years old. He had decided, in the logic of a 5-year-old, that the marriage had ended because he had not been sufficient reason for it to continue. That if he had been better, more, somehow, it might have held. It is one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the memoir of a man who would become Prime Minister. And it is, in its way, the truest record of what the official life of 24 Sussex Drive cost the people who lived inside it. In the early 1980s, the exact year is not recorded with precision, but Justin was approximately 11. There was a morning at a school gate in Ottawa. Margaret arrived. She was not well. The untreated bipolar disorder had been cycling for years by then. The highs that felt like flying, the lows that felt like drowning, and the unmedicated careening between the two that the world had been watching and calling by the wrong name. A relationship had ended. She was in the grip of something she could not control and could not explain. She stood outside the gate and she wept. Justin came out of the school. He saw her. He walked over without hesitation, the way children walk toward their parents in distress before they have learned to be self-conscious about it, before the world has taught them that some kinds of pain are meant to be kept at a distance. He put his arms around her. "It'll be okay, Mom," he said. "Things will get better." He was 11 years old. Justin Trudeau himself recorded this moment in Common Ground, matter-of-factly, without drama, in the tone of a man who has made peace with a thing and is now simply reporting it. He had comforted his mother at a school gate when he was 11 years old. It had happened. It was part of what had shaped him. But read slowly, that scene contains everything. A boy who has learned, before he has learned anything else, that the adults in his life are not always able to hold themselves together. A boy who steps forward anyway, who offers comfort before he has been taught to offer it, who says the words that needed saying because no one else was there to say them. A boy becoming, at 11, something he should not have needed to become for another decade at least. And a woman, his mother, standing at a school gate in Ottawa, held together momentarily by the arms of a child. This is what the official record does not show. This is the room in the story that the biographies of powerful men tend not to enter. Margaret, in those years after the separation, was living what she later described as two lives simultaneously. There was the New York life, Studio 54, the famous faces, the manic brightness of a woman who was, in the clinical sense, frequently manic. She studied acting at the American Place Theater. She danced. She photographed. She moved through a world that mistook her energy for glamour and her instability for charisma. And then she would return to Ottawa. She would climb the stairs at 24 Sussex Drive, the house she had fled, the house her children still called home, and she would put Justin and Sasha and Michelle to bed. She would sit in their rooms for a while, in the dark, listening to them breathe. After I left Pierre, she recalled, I really was living life as two different people, and not just because I was fluctuating between mania and depression. I was also living two different lives out in the world, hobnobbing with the rich and famous in New York and London one minute, then putting my children to bed on the second floor at 24 Sussex the next. It was, needless to say, very confusing. The confusion was not, as the tabloids suggested, a symptom of recklessness. It was a symptom of an illness nobody had diagnosed. And underneath the confusion, underneath the Studio 54 photographs and the headlines, and the second memoir that detailed, with characteristic frankness, the famous men she had known, underneath all of it was a woman who was coming back, always, to put her children to bed. That woman does not appear in most accounts of this period. She was there nonetheless. There is a sentence Margaret Trudeau said in an interview many years later that contains the whole of this chapter in 11 words. I had no idea there was such a thin line between sanity and insanity. She was not speaking theoretically. She was speaking from inside an experience that had lasted, at that point, the better part of a decade. A decade of rising and falling, of being called unstable by people who did not know she was ill, of performing two lives in two cities while her children grew up in a house she had needed to escape. The line was thin. She had crossed it in both directions more times than she could count. And she had crossed it, this is the thing that the headlines always missed, while still being, in the moments that mattered most, a mother. A mother standing at a gate. A mother sitting in the dark beside a sleeping child. A mother who could not always hold herself together, but who kept coming back. That was not the story the world told about Margaret Trudeau in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But it was the true one. And it was about to get heavier. March 4th, 1977. 6 years to the day since the secret wedding in North Vancouver. 6 years since the 12 guests and the family portrait that wasn't a family portrait, and the morning Canada woke up to discover its Prime Minister had a bride. Pierre Trudeau was in Ottawa. He was, as he nearly always was, governing. Margaret was in Toronto. She was not at a state function. She was not fulfilling an official role. She was not standing beside her husband in a receiving line, wearing the right dress, saying the right things to the right people. She was at the El Macambo Club, a small, legendary music venue on Spadina Avenue, watching the Rolling Stones play a surprise set for an audience that had no idea when they walked in that this was the night they would remember for the rest of their lives. It was her wedding anniversary. She had chosen to spend it there. The story of Margaret Trudeau and the Rolling Stones became, in the weeks that followed, one of the most reported pieces of gossip in Canadian history. The details were irresistible. The Prime Minister's wife, the world's most famous rock band, a Toronto nightclub, a flight to New York the following day. Rumors multiplied about Mick Jagger, about Ronnie Wood, about what exactly had happened in the hours that the press could not account for. Ronnie Wood addressed the rumors directly, years later, in his 2007 memoir. Of Margaret, he wrote, "We had a wonderful time, and her husband's name never came up." That sentence, careful, fond, and entirely non-committal, became the definitive account. Her husband's name never came up. She had spent her wedding anniversary in a room where the most famous marriage in Canada was simply absent. Not discussed, not a weight, not a constraint, just absent. It is worth sitting with what that meant to her. Not the scandal of it. The press handled the scandal with considerable enthusiasm. But the relief of it. The specific physical relief of being in a room where you are simply a person and not a role. She described the escape to New York that followed as her ultimate freedom trip. She had left Pierre. She had left 24 Sussex Drive. She had left the protocols and the motorcades and the official functions and the carefully managed image of a marriage that had, by then, been privately over for some time. She had run. But here is the thing about running when you are the mother of 3 small boys. You always come back. Justin was 5. Sasha was 3. Michelle was 1. Pierre, who had learned over 6 years of marriage to manage the disruption that Margaret represented, did not pursue her publicly. He issued, through channels, a statement confirming that the couple had separated. He said it was a private matter. He maintained the line he had always maintained, between the public man and the private life. The boys stayed at 24 Sussex Drive, with their father, with the security detail and the household staff and the vast official machinery of a prime minister's residence. Margaret, in New York, was photographed on Madison Avenue in a fur coat, smiling in the winter sun, looking, to anyone who did not know what was happening inside her, like a woman who had finally found what she was looking for. She was not quite that woman yet, but she was looking. What the photographs from those New York years do not show is the second life she was living in parallel. She would fly to New York. She would study acting at Win Hanman's American Place Theater. Seriously, she would later insist, not as a dilettante, but as a student. She danced at Studio 54, which she described, with characteristic frankness, as her workout. She moved through a world of famous faces and borrowed glamour, and the particular brightness that, in the clinical vocabulary she did not yet have, was called mania. And then she would fly back to Ottawa. She would go to 24 Sussex Drive. She would climb the stairs to the second floor. She would find her sons, Justin, serious and watchful, Sasha, gentle, Michelle, the youngest, the one who had his father's love of the outdoors and his mother's openness to the world. She would put them to bed. She would sit in their rooms in the dark for a while. Then she would fly back to New York. I was living 2 different lives out in the world, she recalled. Hobnobbing with the rich and famous in New York and London 1 minute, then putting my children to bed on the second floor at 24 Sussex the next. The press saw the New York life. It made better copy. The woman dancing at Studio 54 was a story. The woman sitting in the dark beside her sleeping children was not. But the woman sitting in the dark was the one who was real. She published her first memoir in 1979, Beyond Reason, a title that said more than she perhaps intended. The book sold widely, fueled by the public's appetite for the story behind the headlines. It was candid in ways that made Pierre Trudeau's people deeply uncomfortable, and candid in ways that made Margaret's readers understand, for the first time, that what they had been watching was not recklessness, but suffering. She wrote about the long tunnel of darkness she had lived inside her marriage. She wrote about the isolation, the undiagnosed depression, the desperation that had no outlet in the official life of a prime minister's wife. She wrote about Ted Kennedy, without naming him by name, though he was quickly identified, and described in her memoir a feeling she had while sitting in the gallery of the United States Congress, listening to Pierre address a joint session. She had sat there, she wrote, torn between an intense need for him and a longing for Ted Kennedy. It was, even by the standards of political memoir, an extraordinary sentence. Pierre responded, in his own memoir, published years later, by devoting a single brief paragraph to the breakdown of his marriage, ending with the observation that anyone who had lived through such a thing would understand. He did not elaborate. He maintained, to the last, the line he had always drawn. Margaret had never been able to draw that line. It was, perhaps, the most essential difference between them. A New York psychiatrist finally said the words she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, her entire adult life to hear. "Margaret," he said, "you are a manic depressive." He prescribed medication. Things, she recalled, sort of snapped back into place. She returned to Canada. She resumed life with her children. She and Pierre learned, slowly and imperfectly, to co-parent. To be, if not what they had been, then something functional. Something that served the boys. She married again in 1984, a real estate developer named Fried Kemper. They had 2 more children, Kyle and Alicia. She retreated for a time into something that looked like ordinary life. The medication helped. The diagnosis helped. Having a name for the thing that had pursued her through her 20s and 30s, having a framework, finally, for the rising and the falling, helped. But the diagnosis, she would say later, was incomplete. It was a first step, not a final one. She had been told what she had. She had not yet been fully treated for it. And the medication of the mid-1980s was imprecise, often making things worse before it made them better. Weight gain, depression of a different kind, a flatness that was its own form of suffering. She kept going. She always kept going. "It was a symptom of bipolar disorder," she said once, of the night with the Rolling Stones. Not defensively, but with the light touch of a woman who has finally understood the story she was living from the inside. Someone else in my condition would just run away with someone from the 7-Eleven. But we would run away. That's the bottom line. I was just in a fancy circle. The laugh in that sentence is real. The grief underneath it is also real. Both things are true, simultaneously. That is, perhaps, the most honest description she ever gave of her own life. By the late 1990s, Margaret Trudeau was 50 years old. She had survived the marriage. She had survived the separation. She had survived the headlines and the second memoir, and the years of moving between New York and Ottawa, and the particular exhaustion of a life lived for too long without the right map. She had her children. She had a fragile stability. She had, in her own words, learned to cope. But the heaviest thing was still ahead of her. It was waiting in the mountains. In a lake she would later call her son's grave. November 13th, 1998. Eastern British Columbia. The mountains above Kokanee Glacier Provincial Park are gray and white and absolute. The snow has come early this year, earlier than usual, heavier than expected. A group of 4 young men have been on a 2-day backcountry skiing trip. They are making their way back. Michel Trudeau is 23 years old. He has his father's love of the outdoors, the mountains, the cold air, the particular silence that exists above a certain altitude where the world below cannot reach you. He has been living in Rossland, working at Red Mountain Resort, building a life that is, by all accounts, quietly his own. He is, as a family friend once wrote, a boy who combined the best of his brothers, Justin's seriousness, Sasha's gentleness, something that was entirely himself. He is the youngest. He is the one Margaret loved with a ferocity that had no adequate language. The avalanche comes without warning. It takes Michel in seconds. It pushes him. This is the specific, unbearable detail. Not down the mountain, but into Kokanee Lake. The water is deep and cold, and November dark. His companions, helpless at the edge, scream into the silence. His body is never found. Margaret Trudeau was 3,000 miles away when the call came. She had been in Vancouver, committed briefly to a psychiatric facility, this time for a breakdown that had followed a television interview in which she had made claims that were not true. It was a moment of crisis in a life that had known many crises. She was 50 years old. She was not well. And then the phone rang. There are no adequate words for what the next hours contained. There are no adequate words for what it means to be told that your child is gone. And then to be told that he is gone in a way that means you will never hold what is left of him. No grave to stand at, no marker. Only a lake in the mountains, cold and permanent, and keeping its silence. In the weeks that followed, Margaret was asked by reporters to speak about Michel. She appeared at a press conference. Fragile, she was described as fragile. And she said the things that needed to be said. But in the private hours, in the rooms where the reporters were not, she said something else. I felt I had to go with Michel, she said, in an account published later in Maclean's magazine. I couldn't see any other way. I couldn't have him alone. She paused. Then she added, quietly, maybe I should put it another way. I didn't want to be alone. In my grief, I was so focused on the loss of my boy that I forgot that I had a full life and lots of people who love me very much who are alive. She had been, in those words, close to the edge. Not the edge of the mountain, the other edge. In January 2000, 14 months after Michel's death, Margaret returned to Kokanee Lake. She stood at the water's edge. The mountains were silent. The lake was the same lake it had always been. Gray-green, cold, holding nothing it was willing to give back. She later described seeing, above the surface of the water, what she could only call a great shaft of light, rising, as though something was leaving. I saw this great shaft of light, she said, that seemed to me to be taking his spirit out of the lake. Whether you believe in such things or not, and Margaret did not frame it as a question of belief, but as a statement of what she saw, the image itself is unbearable in its tenderness. A mother standing at the edge of a lake that had taken her youngest son. A woman who had survived so much, standing at the one threshold she could not cross and could not turn away from, watching a light rise. Justin was with her that day. He was 28 years old. He would later say that the lake was glorious, one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. He and Margaret had come to raise awareness about avalanche safety. They stood together at the water, a mother and her eldest son looking at the grave of her youngest. There are no photographs of that moment that do justice to what it contained. In September of 2000, less than 2 years after Michel, Pierre Trudeau died. He died at home in Montreal of prostate cancer on September 28, 2000. He was 80 years old. He had been ill for some time. Justin and Sasha were with him. Margaret was there too, at his bedside, in the room where the man she had married and fled and learned, slowly, to call a friend, took his last breath. She had not been his wife for more than 20 years. She was there nonetheless. The country mourned in a way it had not mourned a political figure in decades. The state funeral drew heads of government from across the world. Justin, 28 years old, stood at the podium of Montreal's Notre Dame Basilica and delivered a eulogy that stopped the country. A young man, composed beyond his years, speaking of his father with a love so precise, it felt almost architectural. Margaret sat in the front pew. She had lost her son. Now she had lost her former husband. The two men who had, between them, defined the geography of her adult life, gone within 2 years of each other. The bipolar disorder, which had been cycling for 30 years, now had nothing left to hold it. In the words of a later CBC account, the deaths of her son and ex-husband led to devastating lows. That is the official language. The private language was different. It was cedar on the floor. It was her family staging an intervention in late 2000, calling in a psychiatrist named Colin Cameron, who specialized in trauma disorders. It was Margaret running into the snow without a coat when they came for her. It was the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Centre. It was the chaos that Dr. Cameron found when he walked into her home, and Margaret's own account of that time, years later. I thought everything was normal. She thought everything was normal. She was standing in a house with cedar on the floor, and she thought everything was normal. This is what untreated bipolar disorder at its most severe looks like. Not drama, not performance. A complete detachment from the reality that everyone else can see. A woman who had survived everything: the marriage, the tunnel, the escape, the diagnoses, the 2 children she had carried into the world on Christmas Day, the son she had buried in a lake, standing in her own home, unreachable, inside a mind that had finally exceeded its capacity to hold what had been given to it. And then, the word that changes everything. Not in 2000, not in 2001 when she was finally hospitalized, but on May 5, 2006, in a public statement that made headlines across Canada and, in time, around the world. Margaret Trudeau announced that she had bipolar disorder. She said it plainly, without apology, without the careful management of image that had governed, for better and worse, so much of her public life. She said it the way a person says something they have been waiting a very long time to say, not because they have rehearsed it, but because it is simply, finally, true. Being bipolar is a huge exaggeration of your emotions, she said in one of the many interviews that followed. You can be pretty high and also terribly low. I've been through it all. She had been through it all. But here is the thing that this chapter has been building toward, the thing that reframes everything that came before it. The diagnosis was not a tragedy. It was an answer. For 30 years, from the postpartum depression that the doctor had dismissed as baby blues, through the tunnel at 24 Sussex Drive, through the mania and the crashes and the running and the returning, through the years of being called unstable and eccentric and an embarrassment, for 30 years, there had been a question at the center of Margaret Trudeau's life. What is wrong with me? Not asked in self-pity, asked in genuine bewilderment. Asked by a woman who had looked at her own behavior, her own suffering, her own extraordinary and exhausting and uncontrollable inner life, and could not understand why she could not simply be well. The answer had been there the entire time.
It had a name. It had a treatment. It had a community of people who understood it from the inside.
It had, eventually, a pharmacology that worked, that found, after years of imprecise and sometimes harmful attempts, the right combination that allowed her brain to do what it had always, in its better moments, been capable of. I had to go into such deep, deep treatments, she said, to get my brain health back, to get my mental health back, after I was thrown to the ground. But that was then. Now I think we can shorten the time. That was then. She had survived the diagnosis. She had survived the treatment. She had survived the grief and the lake and the cedar on the floor and the snow without a coat. She was still here. And the boy she had comforted at a school gate, the boy who had put his arms around her and said, "It'll be okay, Mom," was watching. He had always been watching. He was about to step into a story of his own. October 19th, 2015, Montreal. An election night headquarters somewhere in the city, the kind of room that fills, on nights like this, with a particular quality of noise. The noise of people who have been waiting for something and are now watching it arrive. The results come in across the country, riding by riding, the map changing color in real time. And then, the moment. The number that makes the room erupt. The Liberal Party of Canada has won a majority government. Justin Pierre James Trudeau, 43 years old, former school teacher, son of a legend, father of 3, is the 23rd Prime Minister of Canada. He walks onto the stage with his wife and his children. His mother is in the room. Margaret Trudeau, 67 years old, stood in that crowd and watched her son become Prime Minister of Canada. She had been at 24 Sussex Drive as a bride. She had lived there as a First Lady. She had escaped from it. She had called it, in a sentence so perfectly weighted it has followed her for 40 years, the crown jewel of the federal penitentiary system. Now she was watching her son walk toward it. She would return to that house, as a visitor, as a grandmother, as a woman who had, by the longest and most unlikely of routes, arrived at something that felt, if not quite like peace, then like its closest available neighbor. "It just was a golden moment in my life," she said in a radio interview the next morning. "I think I had the best hug of my whole life from my son." She paused. Then she said, "It's not my turn. It's their turn. And that's the wonder and the joy of life. I had my turn. It was a rocky, wonderful road I was on. A rocky, wonderful road." It is perhaps the most Margaret Trudeau sentence she ever said. The rockiness and the wonder held in the same breath, without hierarchy, without insisting that one cancels the other out. She had been telling her story by then, for nearly a decade. Since 2006, when she had stood up and said the words bipolar disorder, plainly and publicly, and without the careful image management that had governed so much of her life. She had become something she had never been in the years of the official photographs and the state dinners and the wrong-length dress at the White House. She had become useful. She traveled the country. She spoke in auditoriums and community centers and university lecture halls. She spoke to people who had never been to a state dinner, who had never heard of Kokanee Lake, who knew nothing about the Rolling Stones or the crown jewel of the federal penitentiary system. She spoke to people who were sitting in the dark and could not get up, who were cycling between highs that felt like flying and lows that felt like drowning, who had been told, by doctors, by families, by the silence of a world that did not yet have good language for what they were carrying, that what they were experiencing was something else. Baby blues, eccentricity, instability. She told them the truth. She told them it had a name. She told them the name was not a sentence. The first thing that happens to someone with a mental illness, she said, in the throes of it, is that they lose all their self-esteem. They don't think they fit in. She knew this from the inside. She had not fit in, not in the official life of 24 Sussex Drive, not in the protocols and the motorcades and the carefully managed image of a marriage that was, behind its closed doors, a woman drowning in slow motion. She had not fit in because the space she had been given was not shaped for her. It had been shaped for a rose in a lapel. And she had never been that. She had been something wilder, something that needed more room than a lapel provides. It had taken her half a lifetime to understand that this was not a flaw. Michelle is still in the lake. This is a fact that does not soften with time. Kokanee Lake is still cold and gray and keeping its silence. November still comes every year to that part of British Columbia. The mountains are still absolute. Margaret has said more than once that she does not grieve the way other mothers grieve, that the bipolar disorder changes the texture of mourning, makes it non-linear, makes it arrive in ways and at times that do not follow the expected shape. She has also said that she thinks of him. Always. As a mother, she said at a press conference in 2000, speaking about avalanche safety, speaking about the thing that had taken Michelle, speaking in the careful, measured tone of a woman who has decided that the only way to carry unbearable weight is to put it to use. I just want to stop one more mother from going through what I went through. One more mother. Not a politician's sentence, not a slogan. The sentence of a woman who knows, from the inside, the specific geography of what she is describing. The phone call, the lake, the absence that does not end, the grief that has to be shaped into something, or it will shape you instead. There is a portrait that Margaret keeps above her bed, or kept, in the years when journalists were still visiting her Ottawa apartment. It is a photograph of her holding Justin as a baby. She is young in it. Her face has the particular openness of someone who has not yet learned what is coming. Beside it, on the wall, is a print of Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, the goddess rising from the water. It is, perhaps, an unconscious choice, or perhaps not unconscious at all. A woman who has spent her life rising from various waters, from the tunnel, from the lake, from the cedar-strewn floor of a breakdown that nearly ended everything, might find in that image something that feels like recognition. She once said, in a sentence that deserves to be the last word on a life that has not always been given the right words, I can't be a rose in any man's lapel. She was right. She was never a rose. She was something that grew outside the formal garden entirely, something that needed weather and open ground, and the kind of space that official residences do not provide. She was a woman whose illness was mistaken for recklessness, whose suffering was mistaken for scandal, whose love for her children was real and constant, and almost entirely invisible in the public record of her life. She was the wife of one prime minister and the mother of another. She was the first woman in Canadian history to hold both of those positions. She was a mental health advocate. She was a memoirist. She was a photographer. She was a woman who ran toward the Rolling Stones on her wedding anniversary and flew back to put her children to bed, and stood at a lake in November and watched a light rise from the water. She was all of these things at once, in the way that people actually are, complicated and contradictory, and not reducible to any single version of themselves. The crown jewel of the federal penitentiary system is still standing on the bluff above the Ottawa River. Justin Trudeau has since left office. The House has passed to another government, another family, another chapter. Margaret Trudeau, 77 years old, is still here. She outlived the prison. She outlived the prisoner. She is still, in her own way, rising.